Welcome to the Purchasing Division's online training module for basic purchasing. This session is targeted at new state employees in the public procurement field to help familiarize them with the state purchasing process, laws, rules, and procedures. The purchasing decision path will be discussed as well as an overview of basic rules and regulations relating to the levels of purchasing authority. Our mission and goals. The Purchasing Division stands behind its mission to its customers to provide prudent and fair spending practices in procuring quality goods and services at the lowest cost to state taxpayers by maximizing efficiencies and offering guidance to our customers. We are a customer-driven organization in which we strive to continually improve the services offered to maximize the efficiency of state government and to provide leadership and guidance to customers, state agencies, vendors, legislators, and the general public in building lasting business relationships. Statutory authority. The Purchasing Division was created in Section 5A3 of the West Virginia Code, in which our duties are outlined. By code, we were created for the purpose of establishing centralized offices to provide purchasing, traveling, and leasing services to the various state agencies. This provision applies to all of the spending units of state government, unless exempted by law. Exemptions. The West Virginia Code does specifically exempt certain state entities from the state purchasing process, including the legislative branch, judicial branch, higher education, Division of Highways, specifically road construction, and more than 30 other full or partial exemptions. The Purchasing Division Procedures Handbook details other commodities and services exempt from the state purchasing process. Code of State Rules. The Purchasing Division is also bound by the Code of State Rules 148 CSR 1. This legislative rule applies to all spending units of state government except those statutorily exempted, though exempted spending units may elect to follow this rule. The purpose of the Code of State Rules is to further clarify the provisions of the West Virginia Code. It provides more detailed information regarding the intent and the requirements of the law. Purchasing Handbook. In addition to the West Virginia Code and the Code of State Rules, the Purchasing Division Procedures Handbook provides additional detail, guidance, and instruction to state procurement officers and support staff who are required to use Purchasing Division procedures to perform procurement and other related activities. This handbook is available online at the Purchasing Division's website. The specific web address will be provided later in this session. Organizational structure. The Purchasing Division is organized into 3 sections, in addition to the Purchasing Director's Office. The section which handles the actual procurement function is the Acquisition and Contract Administration section. It is this section's responsibility to purchase products and services for state agencies in excess of $25,000. This section also oversees the managing of contracts in excess of $1 million, excluding construction contracts, and the inspection of purchasing documents to ensure compliance with state laws, regulations, and procedures. The Communication and Technical Services section oversees various administrative functions as well as the communication, professional development and training, and technology aspects of the division. The administrative functions of this section includes administration, bid receipt, imaging and retention of records, purchase order encumbrance process, and vendor registration, which is required by law. The Program Services section encompasses various programs which the division administers, including fixed assets, surplus property program, and travel management. Purchasing Division Path. As you see on the screen, there is a decision path used in the state purchasing. By reviewing this path, it will assist you as an agency procurement officer to make the appropriate decisions necessary to ensure that all procedures are followed in accordance with statutory and regulatory requirements. There are 11 steps in this decision path. Let's take a look at each decision needed to complete your purchase. Step 1. The first step of the decision path is the determination of need. The agency needs to determine what product or service is required by its organization. This determination would include such aspects as the quality level, delivery requirements, estimated costs, and other basic information about the product or the service required. Step 2. Once the need has been established, the agency must determine if the product or service is available from internal resources which are mandatory by law. Internal resources includes products or services available through the correctional industries within the Division of Corrections, the state use law, which includes sheltered workshops under the administrative oversight of the West Virginia Association of Rehabilitation Facilities, or otherwise known as WARF, or the West Virginia State Agency for Surplus Property. Step 3. If a product or service is not available through any of the internal resources within the state, the agency must determine if the product or service is available on a statewide or agency contract. The Purchasing Division manages approximately 100 statewide contracts for a variety of products and services, including office supplies, vehicles, computer equipment, furniture, and cleaning supplies. If available on a statewide or agency contract, the agency must purchase those products or services in accordance with purchasing guidelines. Statewide contracts are mandatory for agencies to use. Only the purchasing director may exempt an agency from not utilizing a statewide contract. Step 4. The fourth step of the purchasing decision path is sole source and emergency purchases. If the product or service is not available through an existing statewide or agency contract, the agency must determine if the purchase is competitive, meaning that more than one resource is available to provide the product or service. Sole source means that there is only one vendor who can provide the product or service. In order to make that determination, state agencies must conduct market research to look for competitive sources for that product or service. Those efforts for that market research must be documented and maintained with the agency file. An emergency is an occurrence where there is a threat to person or property. In cases of an emergency, the West Virginia Code and the Code of State Rules both require that bids be obtained where possible. Obviously, depending upon the severity of the emergency, if an agency makes a determination that time does not allow the agency to obtain bids from vendors for the emergency situation, the product or service may be attained. However, the file must be fully documented with an explanation as to why time was of the essence where emergency bids would not be solicited. If time permits, the agency may place restrictions on the vendors to respond immediately, for example, within a 24-hour period or whatever time frame is deemed appropriate based on the nature of the emergency. Step 5. If a product or service is considered to be competitive and is not available on a statewide or agency contract or through internal resources, the agency must then utilize its delegated purchasing procedures if the requisition is estimated to cost $25,000 or less. Spending levels have been established for agency delegated purchases. Please note that $0 to $2,500 competition is not required, but encouraged. $2,500.01 to $5,000 requires 3 verbal bids documented. $5,000.01 to $25,000 requires 3 written bids documented. Over $25,000 requires the formal bid process through the Purchasing Division. The Purchasing Division delegates authority to state agencies for purchases $25,000 or less. However, agencies are required to follow all of the provisions of the Code, the Rule, and the Handbook when making agency-delegated purchases. Step 6. If a product or service does not meet the definition of a sole source or emergency purchase and is not available through internal resources or on existing statewide or agency contract, it is considered a formal acquisition if it is expected to exceed $25,000. In order to make that determination, agencies will be required to conduct market research in order to access the estimated cost of the product or service. This is necessary to determine if the purchase will be within the agency's delegated authority or will need to be processed through the Purchasing Division through the formal acquisition process. Product purchases most often utilize the request for quotations process, which is the preferred method of purchasing. This method solicits bids for a product, stating the specifications, and awarding the contract to the lowest responsive and responsible bidder. If the purchase is a service, the agency must determine whether the request for quotations or the request for proposals process should be used. These are 2 completely different processes. As stated previously, the request for quotations or RFQ process establishes mandatory requirements with the lowest bid selected. The request for proposals or RFP process is considered a best value purchase process and takes into consideration a vendor's technical ability and suggested solution, with cost not being the sole factor. After the process is determined, the agency develops the purchasing requisition with the specifications and submits it to the purchasing division for processing. Step 7. After the official bid opening on a specified date and time, all bids or proposals, depending upon the bid process used, are opened, evaluated, and an award is made in accordance with purchasing guidelines. All solicitations are posted in the West Virginia Purchasing Bulletin, which is the purchasing division's advertising media. The purchasing division establishes a specific date and time for the official opening of the bids for each solicitation. All bid openings are generally held at 1:30 p.m. during the week. For requests for quotations after the bid opening, the bids are evaluated generally by the agency to ensure that the specifications established as mandatory have been met or exceeded. Once this has been completed and the purchasing division performs its evaluation, a contract award is made to the lowest responsible bidder meeting the requirements of the specification. For requests for proposals, there is a two-step process which requires vendors to submit a technical proposal and a cost proposal. Both proposals are submitted to the purchasing division at the same time, but in a separate sealed envelope by the established bid opening date and time. At the bid opening, only the technical proposal is opened, with only the name of the vendors submitting proposals read aloud. No other information is provided. An evaluation committee is appointed to review the proposals, with copies of the technical proposals provided to each member. Once a technical evaluation is completed by the committee, it is submitted to the purchasing division for review and approval. Once the technical evaluation has been approved, the assigned buyer schedules the cost bid opening. Once the cost bids are opened, they are reviewed by the agency to determine if the costs are within the maximum budget amount. A final evaluation is completed, which includes the technical score, the cost score, and the recommendation for award, and is submitted to the purchasing division for final review and acceptance. Once the purchasing division approves the final evaluation, the assigned buyer issues the contract award. Step 8. Once the purchase order is prepared, it is submitted to the Attorney General's office, as required by law for all purchases exceeding $25,000 to be approved as to form. After the Attorney General's approval, the purchasing division conducts the encumbrance process. The encumbrance of purchase orders ensures the agency has the appropriate funds to make the specific purchase. The encumbrance date is the earliest date the vendor may commence on any contract. Step 9. The Code of State Rules includes information regarding a vendor's right to protest. There are two types of protests available to vendors: a protest of specifications and a protest of contract award. Protests of specifications are required to be submitted to the purchasing division at least 5 business days prior to the established bid opening date and time. In those instances, the purchasing division may issue an addendum and temporarily postpone the bid opening to allow the purchasing division and the agency to review the protest issues and make a decision. The vendor is then notified of the decision, and an addendum is issued to reestablish the bid opening date and time. Protests of contract awards must be made within 5 business days following the award of the contract. Once a contract has been awarded, the successful vendor receives a copy of the purchase order, and all unsuccessful vendors participating in the bid process receive notice that they were not the successful bidder. This is the official notification of the award. Guidance is offered within the Code of State Rules as to what type of information is required in their written protest. Currently, the purchasing division experiences an average of slightly more than just 2% of protests of contracts and specifications. Step 10. Contract management is a process that was established through a purchasing reform effort in 2006, which changed several aspects of the law and rule guiding the state purchasing process. This process requires state agencies to be responsible for establishing benchmarks for their contracts to ensure that the product or services acquired are rendered and are provided in accordance with the contract specifications. The law specifically addresses requirements for contracts in excess of $1 million. Construction contracts are exempt from the contract management process. The Contract Management Office in the Purchasing Division issues letters to agencies for contracts that have been issued in excess of $1 million. There are provisions that those agencies are required to meet in regard to post-award meetings with the vendor in order to review the requirements and deliverables necessary in completion of that contract. There is also specific reporting requirements that the agency is required to follow, which are submitted to the Purchasing Division. Step 11. Inspection of purchasing documents was also addressed in the purchasing reform. This effort enables the Purchasing Division to inspect the products and services rendered to ensure contract compliance. During this process, our inspectors are responsible for reviewing and auditing state spending unit requests and purchases and other transactions and performance that fall under the authority of the Purchasing Division. Our inspectors review the purchasing files to determine whether all of the required procedures have been followed, depending upon the amount of the purchase and the requirements associated with the dollar threshold. It is our goal during our purchasing inspection to educate and inform state agencies of the law, rule, and purchasing procedures which guide this process. Vendor registration. There are also provisions in the West Virginia Code that require vendors who do business with the state of West Virginia to register with the Purchasing Division. All vendors selling $1,000 or more are required to complete a vendor registration form and pay the $125 annual vendor registration fee. There is an exception to this rule, and that is for P-card vendors or purchasing card vendors providing travel-related services or who receive an aggregate total yearly payment of less than $25,000 from a spending unit. Vendors are not required to be registered with the Purchasing Division to submit a bid. However, they must be registered in order to receive a contract or purchase order award. The vendor registration fee also allows access to the West Virginia Purchasing Bulletin, which, as we discussed earlier, contains all of the bidding opportunities expected to exceed $25,000. Definitions. Specific terminology is used in the state purchasing process. Let us review some of these terms and offer you an explanation of their meaning. An agency open-end contract is a purchase order that contains no limits on quantity or dollars spent. It allows an agency to purchase, throughout the years, specific commodities and services necessary for the agency's operation without having to go through the competitive bid process. The change order is the process in order to modify a purchase order or contract that has already been issued. These change orders are necessary in order to make any type of amendments, clarify changes, or cancel the purchase order or contracts that are issued by the Purchasing Division. Change orders may also be issued for agency-delegated purchases, which are contracts valued at $25,000 or less. We have already discussed what constitutes an emergency purchase and the process used. According to the West Virginia Code, state agencies are required to notify the Purchasing Division of any emergency expected to exceed $25,000. Please note that emergency purchases cannot be used for a hardship that results from neglect, poor planning, or a lack of organization by the spending unit. Failure to plan does not make for an emergency situation. There are two types of terms used in specifications: mandatory and non-mandatory. Mandatory terms are requirements that cannot be waived. Vendors who fail to comply with mandatory requirements result in disqualification of their bid. Mandatory terms are indicated by the use of the terms shall, will, or must in the bid specifications. Non-mandatory terms or requirements are indicated by the use of the terms such as may, should, preferred, or could. It is understood that they are permissive or desirables and shall not be used to disqualify vendors. Piggybacking, which is authorized in the West Virginia Code, enables state agencies to utilize an existing open-end contract of the federal government, agencies of other states, other public bodies, or other state agencies to which the requesting agency was not an original party. Piggybacking contracts require prior approval by the purchasing director. A special webpage is available on the Purchasing Division's website, which provides links to approved piggyback contracts permissible for agencies to use without having to go through the bidding process. A pre-bid conference is a meeting conducted between vendors and agency personnel, which provides vendors with an opportunity to discuss the proposed project, ask questions, and to make sure vendors have a good understanding of what is expected and required. Attendance may be mandatory or voluntary, as specified in the bid document. More often, these conferences are mandatory. If the vendor fails to attend a mandatory pre-bid conference, the Purchasing Division or the agency may not accept the vendor's proposal who fails to attend. The request for quotations process is the preferred method to purchase. It establishes mandatory requirements for the purchase order or contract, which vendors are required to meet or exceed. Specifications relate to the description of services that are required for the solicitation. Helpful tools. The Purchasing Division maintains an online procedures handbook that further addresses requirements of West Virginia Code and the Code of State Rules. You can find a link to this handbook on the screen in front of you. For a complete list of definitions, abbreviations, and acronyms, visit Section 2 of the handbook. In addition, process checklists can be found in Appendix O. The process checklists have been prepared by transaction type in order to provide the agency guidance as to what type of documents, approvals, and information are required to be submitted to the Purchasing Division for that specific transaction type. Also on the screen in front of you is a link to the Purchasing Affidavit. This is an affidavit that contains various provisions of law that agencies are required to certify that the vendor is in compliance with, such as not owing to the state a debt greater than $1,000. We are providing you with links to the West Virginia Code and Code of State Rules as those related to the purchasing requirements. Also provided are some links regarding training. We have a link to our online training modules and a link to our in-house training program, which offers various classes on numerous topics of purchasing all throughout the year, located in Building 15 of the Capitol Complex in Charleston. Contact information. Should you have additional questions relating to the state purchasing process, you are encouraged to contact your agency procurement officer. For a link to all of our agency procurement officers, visit our Vendor Resource Center at the web address provided. Additional assistance may be provided at the Acquisition and Contract Administration section webpage, which contains information relative to the contracting function of the Purchasing Division. Also located at this site is the list of assigned buyers for all state agencies required to abide by the procurement laws, rules, and procedures of the Purchasing Division.